Welcome everyone to the 8th year of our ongoing discussion group, Art, Political Culture, and Civic Life. Today we will be discussing speaking out, how acts of conscience contend with power. And this is a topic I think that touches all of our lives in the sense that we've had moments, whether it's with friends, at home, family, neighborhood, at work, or in the political and public sphere, in which they are ethical moments when we consider or do speak out. And when I speak about speaking, we're not talking about just simple, like formal types of speech, but political demonstrations, workers organizing, the building speech acts which are made up of statues or even graffiti. There are a whole range of speaking out in the public square. And as we all know, when you do speak out, there is peril and danger. It's not an easy thing to do. Today, we've gathered a wonderful international group. People have come in from all over the world. The original group, the spirit of it is a dinner table conversation, informal dialogue and exchange of ideas, no preparation, no citations, just a free-flowing discussion. And to kick off the discussion, we have three incredible public voices. I'll introduce them all three, and then they'll begin a discussion amongst themselves, and then we'll expand it to the whole group. First, Pratap Mehta, who is a prominent public intellectual and distinguished academic from India. He has taught political philosophy at Ashoka University, where he also served as vice chancellor. He has an important newspaper column of political commentary, and he's been a longtime critic of Hindu nationalism, Indian nationalism, and recently the Modi government, who's never liked the critical voice, pressured Ashoka University to ask Pratap to rein it in. And on principle, Pratap resigned his position, his professorship, which has created a stir in India and throughout the world, a concern about the infringement of speech of public intellectuals and academics. We have also Randy Kennedy, a professor at Harvard Law School, whose new book of essays is titled Speaking Out. And Randy has written many books about the intersection of race, law, and justice. Finally, Jim Carroll, another important public voice who writes for the New Yorker and for many years, the Boston Globe. He has written about the Catholic Church, both sympathetically and critically. And his latest book is The Truth at the Heart of a Lie, and it's a critique of the Catholic Church. So Pratap, begin, start us off.
Thank you so much, Kiko and Michael, for sort of letting me crash this lunch party. And given I think the circumstances in India, I think it provides a certain kind of relief, I guess, almost. So what I thought I'd do in the next 8 minutes or so is just talk about an issue that's been puzzling me, and more by way of seeking guidance from this distinguished panel. And that's the place of dissent, and this whole idea of speaking up and speaking loudly in a democracy. As we know conventionally, there always used to be this worry about democracy that majoritarianism can produce a certain kind of conformism, right? That the pressure of public opinion will in some senses weigh heavily on individual dissenters. But one thing that is emerging, I think, very starkly in India at this moment is that the threat that democracy might pose to dissent and speaking up might be more deeper and conceptual than just the empirical fact of public pressure. And let me illustrate this by a line from a recent Supreme Court judgment in India. Talk of Supreme Courts that have, dropped the ball on civil liberties and defending constitutional government. One of the justices, in a decision regulating the right to protest, said, "The mode and manner of dissent against colonial rule cannot be equated with dissent in a self-ruled democracy." And the idea was that people like Gandhi were quite right to protest against colonial rule. You could come out to the streets, you could engage in satyagraha. But if you did that in a democracy, now that we have self-government, this is more illegitimate. Right? And this is a debate that actually goes back to the founding of the Indian Constitution. One of the architects of the Indian Constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, the great Dalit leader, actually also had his eyes on Gandhi. He says very famously in a speech in the Constituent Assembly that once we have democracy, once we have self-rule and the processes of constitutional government in place, then you cannot have what he called the grammar of anarchy. Individual conscience keepers holding this democracy to ransom. And the essential intuition was twofold, that A, you have processes that allow for redressal. You can speak, you can vote, you can petition. And once all those processes are complete and decisions are made, you sort of abide by them. And that the person who was speaking out unilaterally as an act of conscience was actually unilaterally holding the democracy to ransom. So when Gandhi used Tagore's cry, "Ekla chalo," stand alone, that's enough, my cry of my conscience, that was good for colonial times. But in a democracy, that suggested unilateral hubris, right? Who has set you up as the judge against these processes? And it's this thought that Indian Supreme Court judges are increasingly using against dissenters, where the logic seems to be, look, if you protest prematurely, right? By prematurely meaning, if you have an issue, take it up with your politicians, run for elections. And if you can't win elections, hey, too bad. So if you protest prematurely, you're not abiding by the process. But if you protest after the process is over, then you are denying the legitimacy of the process, right? You see the kind of catch-22 here. And what it suggests to me is that what dissent has become in some democracies is that dissent, the opposite, it's the opposite of consent, right? It's a form of withdrawing of consent. And so dissent has become to consent what falsehood is to truth, or perhaps heresy is to faith. And it's for this reason, and using this logic, that courts have increasingly started to criminalize dissent. That this act of unilateral speaking out, setting yourself up as a judge against a democratic process, right? That's got to be some kind of treasonous or criminal act, because it should be unnecessary in a democracy, right? And the puzzle I have in some senses, I think, is that what's at stake, I think, in these court pronouncements is that it's very important to a democracy's self-image that it keeps mobilizing the myth of consent, right? That's what makes these processes legitimate. The person who speaks out individually, right, the genuine dissenter who's withdrawing consent, their crime is not disagreement. Their crime is not even speaking their conscience. Their crime is, in a sense, puncturing this myth of consent, right? I'll take another example. For example, the way in which Indian labor laws are now treating the right to strike. One of the interesting things about strikes, to my mind, we can talk about their economic rationale and so forth, is that strikes typically puncture the myth that the labor relationship is a purely consensual, contractual relationship, right? And so what I want to submit to you is that if democracies require for their legitimacy this myth of consent, right, then does that very myth also make it much harder for a dissenter to actually find legitimacy in a democracy? That in some senses, you're puncturing that foundational myth of consent by, I think, dissenting. And so when our Supreme Court then said that the mode of manner modern manner of dissent against colonial rule cannot be equated with dissent in a self-ruled democracy, it then became a license to that Supreme Court to legitimize a whole series of laws that actually begin to criminalize dissent in some serious sense. So protesters on the street, right? They're again withdrawing consent. How do you construct this figure of the protester? It's got to be some kind of treasonous activity, right? After all, you had elections, you lost. Why are you still protesting? The way the courts then use, for example, provisions of bail. If you're a genuine political protester, courts, you would argue, would perhaps be lenient, right? They would think political protest is at least not a crime. It may be an infraction of a certain kind, but not a crime. Yet, in using the law of bail, the Indian Supreme Court once again constructs the figure of the political dissenter as a protester, as withholding consent to the legitimacy of the process itself. And so, as a provocation, what I want to submit to you is that even more than the pressure of social conformism, it's democracy's founding myth that it mobilizes the consent of its people that is actually making it harder for democracies to actually understand the place of genuine political dissent amidst their midst. So that's, I guess, the opening gambit I want to place on the table, and would love to hear, what colleagues might have to say about this.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with everyone. And the first thing I'd like to do is to salute our colleague from and who's in India. I read a couple of pieces about what you've been doing and what you've been facing and just your situation, and want to express solidarity and hopes for the future. It's no little thing to resign. It's no little thing to do things that are going to be displeasing to folks in authority, particular folks in authority who have shown that they are willing to use their power to inflict pain. And so I wish you the best. And again, a salute. With respect to your comments about democracy, gosh, that's very interesting. It sounds like the Supreme Court of India, at least the opinion that to which you alluded, that sounded like democratic centralism of a sort that Lenin would have liked. So you debate, but then once there's a debate, everybody has to be in line, and if you're not in line, you can be shot. It doesn't seem to me that. I mean, that's one conception of democracy. It seems to me that one problem we have is that this word democracy, it's a word that's often used. It has many positive connotations, but it's a word that's all over the place. What do we really mean by democracy? One of the things that I like about the way that democracy is used in the United States is that embedded in the notion of democracy is an idea of protests and dissent. And even if the minority loses the election, they can still mobilize and still say, we don't agree. Yeah, you won the election, but we're going to try to vote you out. And it seems to me that idea of democracy, that the notion of people on the other side continuing to have the right to disagree with the majority, it seems to me that should be embedded in a decent conception of democracy. Democracy can be indecent. I think that you could have a perfectly horrible, horrific democracy, and then you can have decent democracy, and that we need to maybe break down this term democracy and make it clear that, you know, majoritarianism can be awful. You know, so anyway, that's the one last thing I'd like to say is when I thought of when Kiku, you know, when I saw this session advertised, and you know, when I think of dissent, the people that I immediately think about in American history, when I think of dissent, the people who I immediately think about are the people in antebellum America who raised their voices against slavery.
Yeah.
I mean, these were people who were facing a very power, you know, the slave power. They were going up against something that, I mean, it's hard for you to imagine how they could not have thought that they would prevail anytime soon. Yeah. Another thing that grabs me about those dissenters were, I mean, you had African-American abolitionists, don't want to forget them, the great Frederick Douglass and others. I have in mind, however, in particular, the white folks who were abolitionists. And one of the things that I've always, that's particularly interested me about dissenters, protesters, are protesters who actually were privileged and went against their privilege in raising their voices. So I think of, you know, good white people. And, you know, I think of William Lloyd Garrison. I think of Wendell Phillips. I think of Charles Sumner. And I think of Thaddeus Stevens, all of whom, white folks, who put themselves in various degrees of jeopardy to fight on behalf of social decency. I'll end with one last thing. You wrote, Pratash, a wonderful letter to your students at Ashoka University explaining your resignation and urging them to continue their struggles even in your absence. And I thought it was a wonderful letter. And it really grabbed me because, you know, you talked about, quote, the dark and ominous shadows that loom over Indian democracy. Well, one of the reasons why that grabbed me is because I feel I'm in the midst of dark and ominous shadows that loom over American democracy. There was one thing that you said with which I disagree, and for purposes of dissent, I want to put it on the table. You said in your letter, I thought it was very sweet, you talked about how students never let you down. Students have let me down. And I don't think, in thinking about criticism and thinking about dissent and thinking about protesters, we ought also be aware of how protesters seeking to voice their conscience, they can be wrong too. They can be tyrants too. They can be vain too. And so at this very time that we're upholding protest, upholding, you know, those who voice dissent, you know, let's not be sentimental. Dissenters can screw up too.
I'd like to pick up where Randy left off and identify myself as a dissenter who gets it wrong. I'm deeply moved, actually, Pratap, by your witness and your struggle. And of course, we're both honored to have Randy's reflections on what you're up to and what we're all dealing with here as we talk about protest. I thought the most useful thing I could do for a very few minutes is answer in a literal way the question that Kiku and Michael put to us: how acts of conscience contend with power. And I would answer the question by saying it depends on what story you tell. The storytelling can be an act of conscience. And I'd like to just very briefly tell a story you all know, but which is for me the most important story of my lifetime, which is the triumph of nonviolence over the impulse to war that took place in the era we generally talk about when we use the phrase the peace movement. And this is relevant to what Pratap said, because of course I'm talking about the great countercurrent of nonviolence that ran through the 20th century, a story that's almost never told, because the 20th century is known mostly as the century of horrific war that set in motion war machines that are still running rampant, the greatest threat to democracy everywhere, especially in the United States of America, whose own war machine has hardly missed a beat over these decades. But it did miss a beat twice. And I think we should tell the story. I'm thinking of the Vietnam War first. People think of the peace movement as having been marginally important in that period, the realpolitik read of that history. But that's wrong, because an important part of that story is often left out. When Richard Nixon was elected to the presidency in 1973 on a peace platform promising to end the war, of course, the first thing he did was determine not to lose the war, and he immediately escalated the bombing campaign and extended the war into Cambodia, a story that's well known. But what wasn't well known is that inside the Pentagon at that point, the generals were also determined not to lose the war, and there was momentum toward the use of nuclear weapons that was unleashed in the early 1970s. The peace movement coming to a climax in 1972, 73, 74, made the escalation toward nuclear use impossible. And it did lead the United States of America to reckon with the defeat in that war. The peace movement stopped the momentum toward nuclear use. It's a story we need to tell. The second chapter of this Gandhi-inspired current of nonviolence took place a few years later when Ronald Reagan came to power, a tribune of violence, if ever there was one, a man who was belligerent beyond any president before him. And in the early 1980s, there was a kind of air of terror about what Ronald Reagan was going to do to the evil empire, as he called it. Well, something happened in 1980, 81, 82 on both sides of the Iron Curtain. On this side, a movement begun by a young graduate student at MIT named Randy Forsberg, a woman, who composed a one-page declaration called A Call for a Freeze in the Nuclear Arms Race, generating a massive grassroots movement that swept the United States, a kind of partner movement to the anti-nuclear impulse that was sweeping Europe in that period. And this grassroots movement against nuclear weapons might not have changed things except for the fluke of the arrival in the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s of Mikhail Gorbachev, who, when he approached Ronald Reagan with a new idea, Ronald Reagan was prepared to say yes to Gorbachev by this grassroots movement that had unsettled American politics. Gorbachev and Reagan agreed for a moment to abolish absolutely all nuclear weapons. It didn't happen. But what did happen was a nonviolent end to the Cold War, a nonviolent end to the nuclear standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, which every criminologist, every expert, including those at Harvard, predicted could never end nonviolently. The nonviolent end of the Soviet-American nuclear standoff is one of history's great, I want to call it a miracle, but it wasn't a miracle because miracles are acts of God. This was an act of grassroots organizing by thousands, millions of people on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Randy Forsberg and Helen Caldicott on this side, Lech Walesa, Andrei Sakharov, and legions of others on the other side. the climax in 1989, the nonviolent dismantling of the Berlin Wall. Most of the people on this call don't remember it. It's the most important positive moment of the 20th century, in my view. And we don't lift it up enough. The most dangerous military confrontation in history ended nonviolently because not of the work of realists, the experts, but because of the work of ordinary people who gathered together in the spirit of Mahatma Gandhi to say no. And that dissent, that protest had its effect. Alas, the United States of America refused to hear it and immediately rescued its own military impulse, going to war in Panama a few months after the Berlin Wall came down, launching the first Gulf War very quickly, which was the chapter 1 of the morass we're living in today. $1 trillion in the military budget every year. I mean, America is bent out of shape when we spend $1 trillion on COVID relief and infrastructure. We spend $1 trillion every year on the Pentagon, which can't win a war against the Taliban. That's the normal moment. But the abnormal moment is the moment that stopped the nuclear impulse in Vietnam, and it stopped the nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. It's a story we must tell. Now we're living through our next series of moments as we see democracy threatened, clearly threatened in India, but as Randy reminds us, grievously threatened in the United States of America. Obviously, everywhere the democratic ideal has been embraced, it's now being questioned. Protest, dissent, speaking the truth to power is absolutely what's required. But most of all, we must have a strong conviction that it can be effective and that the democratic impulse can be rescued and protected. The same way the nonviolent impulse can be rescued and protected. And I'll conclude by acknowledging my gratitude to you, Pratap, for lifting up the memory of Gandhi in your remarks. The hero to whom we constantly return, who made it very clear that there is another way to live on the earth than by killing and by the oppression of the powerless.
Thanks, Jim. Pratap, do you have a response?
I mean, there's so much to say. Just a couple of quick things. I mean, and thanks, Jim and Randy, for those wonderful remarks and actually very inspiring and uplifting. A couple of thoughts. I mean, one, I agree with you, Randy. I mean, I think protesters can be wrong. Nobody should be a judge in their own cause. And in fact, there can sometimes be a grammar to kind of protest where the purpose is to kind of draw a certain kind of attention to the spectacle itself, rather than actually the, in a sense, the principle that underlines it. So I think that warning is well taken. I also agree with you. Of course, democracy means more than elections. Democracy has a much, much deeper ethical and civic meaning. The one thing I have been struck by, however, those and since you as a legal scholar maybe draw you out a bit in this. So one of the things that has been happening in democracies across the world is that the kinds of things that used to be parts of the repertoire of protest. So disagreement is fine. I mean, you lose an election, you publish, you write. But the things that used to be part of repertoires of protest, occupying public parks, let's say occupy Wall Street as an example, strikes. I think labor relations are one area where I think states have armed themselves with more power against labor. I think that was historically ever the case. The use of municipal laws to, in some senses, outlaw protest in different kinds of ways. Because again, protest has all, there's a grammar of spectacle, there's an exemplarity about it. And I think what's intriguing to me, I think at this moment, is how legitimate that construction of protest is becoming in the language of democracy itself. So, I mean, disagreement is fine. I think the formal processes, but the kinds of protests that, in a sense, you were talking about, right, which in some senses did actually transgress public spaces. So, one of the interesting things about the way the Indian Supreme Court wants to construct the idea of a protest, of course, you can protest, but you can't possibly inconvenience anybody, right? You can't possibly ever occupy a public park. You can't possibly ever even obstruct the road in the slightest. And I think it's that moment at which disagreement is seen to be, in some sense, as said, puncturing that myth of consent. It is literally withdrawing some kind of legitimacy to the system. That protester gets constructed as a figure of treason. I'm actually a pretty lucky and privileged, and my story is actually very trivial. I think there's a fellow colleague of ours, Anand Teltumbe, not coincidentally one of India's finest Dalit intellectuals, who's in prison for 2 years, who's been in prison for the last 2 years, along with a colleague, another Harvard Law School graduate, Sudha Bharadwaj. And what is quite remarkable, I think, in the way in which the courts have constructed their cases is this very quick move from saying that, look, so long as you are publishing, it's fine. But the minute you transgress into something that looks even slightly inconvenient to the state, you, in a sense, transgress from being just a person who disagrees with an outcome to something that's potentially treasonous. And I think the interesting thing is, how have democracies allowed the shifting of this line? In the 70s, occupying parks was considered pretty normal. I mean, that's what democracies do. People show up in crowds, right? You have to have lots of Hyde parks everywhere. So I think that's the context in which I was talking about withholding of dissent.
I loved your point, Pratap, that the regimes see dissent as threatening above all because it punctures the founding myth of consent as the ground of democratic legitimacy. That's a deep reading of what's at stake here, because it suggests that the myth of consent is not by itself, maybe not at all, the basis of democracy. Now, the appeal, the tendency to view it that way reflects, I suppose, the tendency to associate democracy with elections. Elections are the moment when consent is conferred. And as I hear your critique of, you're not only arguing for more openness to dissent, you're arguing, if I understand you, for reconceiving what democracy is about. That we should not locate democracy in a moment, because consent is a moment, every 4 years or every 2 years. Instead of locating democracy in a moment, we should identify it with movement, perpetual roiling movement of argument, of dispute, of protest, of debate, of occupation, of contestation, of dissent. Now, the appeal of consent, the case for consent as being the bulwark of democracy, and maybe this would put Modi aside, maybe this was Ambedkar's intuition, that you need consent for democracy, because you need, maybe this is what Ambedkar thought, you need a moment of closure, a moment at least of closure, however provisional, for democracy to work. So my question to you is, can democracy be all movement, without moments of closure, hence consent.
Uh, so wonderful. I mean, love to have a tutorial from you on this. So, I think the way the official theory is meant to go is something like this, right? Which is that democracy ideally combines both those moments of closure and movement. And that's the thing that we call institutions, which is they actually just create processes enough that actually facilitate movement, they structure it, they prevent it from being sort of anarchic, if that's in a sense the thing, but they allow, in a sense, enough dynamism. I mean, even constitutions can be amended, those kinds of things, right? So that's, in a sense, I think, meant to be, I think, the official sort of account of democracy in some ways. That, and certainly a democracy that did not allow for movement would break pretty quickly. I think that's I think pretty I think pretty clear. I think what at least I find, I mean, and again, to keep the Indian situation aside, but I think maybe there's a kind of deeper sort of anxiety there, which is that if consent is the only basis of authority, which, so not just elections, it can, I mean, election is one way of measuring it, or perhaps the sense of the fragility of that authority and the fear about its fragility. What are the political moments where people think that authority is so fragile, right? That the slightest act of questioning counts as, in a sense, undermining the legitimacy of the process of the system as a whole. And I think it's that psychological disposition of fragility, I think, that I'm more interested, just as a kind of what gets politically enacted. I mean, there's the formal argument, is consent really the basis of authority, and so forth. And how democratic publics can actually put their weight behind that sense of fragility, right? That somehow, if tomorrow a crowd were to gather at India Gate, this would be a spectacular staging of some kind of undermining of authority that will not. It's I think that when you just have consent to go on, it's a very, very fragile and tenuous, I think, disposition, and I think that's what leads to this kind of clamp down and almost a kind of visceral reaction that leads the powers that be to assert, saying, no, but there is no dissent here. There is no withdrawal of that consent.
Sergio, you had a question or comment. Unmute. Yeah, great.
Thank you, Kiko. I have many comments and questions, so I'll limit it to just a couple. First, I want to also offer my solidarity to Professor Mehta and thank him for his courageous act of dissent. My first question is specifically to Jim Carroll, as a major voice of dissent within Catholic theology. I wanted to ask Jim if he believes that acts of conscience, like the ones we've been discussing, do require a previous form of knowledge, of universal knowledge, a previous understanding of right and wrong that might be grounded in faith, for example. Or is it possible to express these acts of conscience through a more practical knowledge, a more practical understanding of the situation as it evolves? The second question to the entire panel is, maybe following the discussion about dissent and democracy, I wanted to take it maybe a step further and ask about patriotism. And I'm reminded of the words of Martin Luther King in his famous speech against the Vietnam War. He says, I oppose the war in Vietnam because I love America. He, amongst the other reasons he raises against the Vietnam War and as grounding for his opposition, he uses patriotism. And he also says, there can be no great disappointment where there is great love. So I wanted to ask if you believe not only that dissent is compatible with patriotism, but if it is necessary, a necessary component of one's love for one's country. Thank you.
First, Sergio, greetings to you. It's great to see your face and to hear your voice. Pratap said powerfully, dissent is to consent what heresy is to faith. There is no faith without heresy. Heresy is faith's mode of self-criticism. That's the first thought I would have in response to you. There's a dialectical relationship between consent and dissent. There is not one without the other. There is no consent that doesn't protect dissent. It's not authentic consent if it doesn't. And there is no authentic faith that can't accommodate heresy, because the point is self-criticism has to be the ground of the community, certainly of a democracy. And that goes to Randy's point about the danger of the tyranny of dissenters. The tyrannical dissenters have lost the capacity for self-criticism of their own dissent. And if we're in a dialectical relationship, dissent to consent, heresy to faith, then there's a kind of self-correcting dynamic that protects the community. And that's my thought.
Randy.
Two things. One, just a question that I hope we'll get to as we proceed. Pratash had this nice phrase. He talked about the repertoire of protest. I think we need to think about expanding the repertoire of protest. I mean, in this moment of danger to decent democracy, maybe, as you know, with changed circumstances, we need to have changed modes of dissent, changed modes of protest. I know on my college campus, you know, there's various sorts of protests that come up from time to time. And I've noticed over the past couple of years that when I hear students chanting in Harvard Yard, frankly, they seem bored. They seem boring to me. I don't want to hear, you know, what do we want? Justice. When do we want it now? I'm tired of it. Seriously, when I hear it, it alienates me. I feel like, come on, folks, we need some new chants. And I think that's a serious thing. I think we need some new chants. I think we need some new songs. I think we need some new, you know, some new ways of doing things. Some of the ways in which we're so, you know, some of our habits of protest, they've become all too habitual. They've become boring and you know, formulaic. So that's one thing. Second, on the question of Sergio, you mentioned patriotism. For me, patriotism is a big problem, a real big problem. And I've never, you know, come to grips with it, but it is a problem with me. I mean, you know, why should I feel more, I don't know, empathy, sympathy, fellow feeling to a person who just happened to have been born 50 yards south of the Rio Grande than I feel for a person who happened to be born 50 feet, 50 yards north of the Rio Grande. I mean, I'm, you know, why is that? There's this, you know, I live in a nation state, the United States of America. I am, you know, compelled to live by the rules of it, but, you know, why is it so holy? Why should it grip my feelings, my sympathies in a way that other things don't? Why should I be prepared to sacrifice my life for something, for an abstraction called the United States of America? Frankly, I don't think I am prepared to do that. I feel perfectly, you know, and you know, should I feel love for the United States of America. I mean, given the terrible things that the United States of America has done all around the world, should I actually feel some sort of, unconditional love? I mean, I think that there should be things, I love certain things for a reason, but oftentimes I hear people talk about, patriotism as if it should be sort of an unconditional love for an abstraction called the United States of America. I got a lot of questions about that. And then going to Jim with his wonderful comments about peace. I mean, what has been the agency that has organized such death-dealing violence around the world, not only in the 21st century, but the 20th, and on and on and on and on, the nation state, which is, usually linked in with patriotism. So I think that the patriotism issue, I don't have it all worked out by any means, but I do see it as a huge problem.
How about hearing now, and maybe in response to Randy, whatever else you had in mind, just to keep this dialogue going on the patriotism issue and connecting it to Jim saying about faith and heresy, there's some dialectic. Russ and then Gwyn.
Thanks, Kiku. I noticed that even in the UK, the government is proposing legislation that would give it more power to put a stop to protests that are considered to be really, really super inconvenient. And an example of these are the protests mounted by a group called Extinction Rebellion, which is a group of people protesting the rate at which we're dealing with climate warming. And just yesterday, just over the weekend, a whole bunch of people, half dozen or a dozen people, glued themselves to bridges in London. And they sit down in the middle. It was called the Rebellion of One. One person would sit down in the middle of the lane of traffic with a placard and block traffic. And they've taken over, Oxford Circus and other busy intersections at different times over the past couple of years. And the Home Office in London says, well, the right to protest is a cornerstone of our democracy, but it can't get too inconvenient. And when it gets too inconvenient, we have to put a stop to it. And actually I do. So, Pratap, just to come back to away from the kind of realms, the heights of political theory, and just back to earth for a few minutes. Imagine somebody who's late for work and she's on a bus, and the bus is stuck in traffic because there's this protester sitting in the middle of a lane of traffic on one of the bridges over the Thames. And this person is just not going to get to work on time and is angry and upset. And then so is the purpose of protest to persuade, or is it just to raise the costs of social cooperation so that the protesters get what they want by forcing it on the rest of society?
So thanks for that, Russ. I mean, as you know, I'm not the very big protesting type, right? I think a couple of thoughts, and it actually also ties back to, I think, the patriotism question, I think, in an interesting way, which is that, look, I mean, at one level, protest is supposed to be this safety valve, right? The ultimate test is going to be protests are meant to be an exercise in public reason that appeal to your fellow citizens, right? Which is why they have to be public, which is why, in a sense, their legitimacy will have to be tested in terms of how much sympathy they can evoke, right? And I think most people would say the graver the violation at stake, right? Let's say you're protesting slavery, you're protesting discrimination, you're protesting exclusion of whole religious communities from, the very fundamentals of citizenship, right? In those contexts, I think protests have a different kind of legitimacy than sort of, a protest that's clearly a form of virtue signaling or exhibitionism or in substances, just raising the cost of social. So any good social protest, right? And that was the point of, in a sense, the Gandhian rebellion in some ways, right? Is that it's not appealing to the grammar of violence. It's not appealing to the grammar of force. Look, I can mobilize street power. I can make life difficult for you, right? That's actually not the point. What it is saying is that the normal avenues and channels of our politics do not allow the articulation of some very, very core fundamental moral principles, right? And, and in that sense, the idea with the protest is that when it actually draws together larger and larger number of citizens, it in a sense is meant to be a contribution to that public reason. And I think Randy is exactly right, which is most protests are actually, just aesthetically boring enough that most citizens don't see in them a kind of joint action that they're conducting together. So I don't think it's an either or. I don't think it's a question of just, is protest simply an exercise in counter force? If it's an exercise in counter force, it actually doesn't have any moral valence or legitimacy behind it, right? It has to be an exercise, as George Eliot said, in appealing to some kind of higher rule, not just an exercise in lawlessness, right? And what you're appealing to, what you're counting on is for the protest to stage that higher rule in a way that all the citizens can see, yes, this is actually a principle we all care for and abide by, whether it's anti-discrimination or something like that. So I don't think the choice is that stark, Russ, between, social cost and, I think the moral force of the protest. And the patriotism bit in it, again, I'm completely on board with Randy about sort of, it's not clear sort of what the basis of the nation state would be, but all that patriotism requires to me is simply an expression of the fact that you care, and that act of caring itself, right, actually in some senses means something to your fellow citizens.
Gwen.
Well, I had to come in here because across the road from where I'm sitting lived Ambedkar in London. So I've got to show you his house. I don't know if you can make it out there.
No, it's a great
So
shot.
when he was here, that's where he lived. And we have, indeed, we've even had Modi. You would be interested to hear at the house paying respect. Unbelievable. But I think it's a most brilliantly interesting discussion. And of course, Gandhi again, takes me right back to apartheid South Africa, where I grew up, who inspired protests such as the burning of the passes, with the South African pass laws that dogged Black South Africans for years and years. And there's such a fundamental difference here to how conscience contends with power when it's a kind of power without any participation or democracy in it. And our discussion has moved very much to discussion about democracy and how conscience can act within democracies to make opposition felt. And it's absolutely the warp and weft of a democracy. The debates around conscience and dissent and protests and Extinction Rebellion. We've got a lovely pink boat in the middle of London last year. It's disruptive, but it's a big issue. Let's talk about it. It's part of a democracy. The thing I wanted to say, though, I think is that conscience connects us. It confirms our humanity. And it connects us with other people, reminding us of what it lies at the heart of a democracy, which is people and humanity. And it's very easy for that to be forgotten as the power of the state sort of clicks in to an exercise of an executive. And also, I think, power doesn't really hear conscience very much, but what dissent and conscience does is introduce an element of doubt and questioning to very firm structures. And once doubt is there, questioning and skepticism is there too. The thing is that everything takes a long time for the cracks in a powerful facade, especially of a non-democratic type, to crack. I was thinking about the pass laws, the Sharpeville protest and so on in 1950. Well, they weren't outlawed until 1986. And this is a slow build very often to involve people. Well, that's it really. I guess Randy was, as always, inspiring and interesting to say that it'd be quite nice to extend the nature of protest to true. So sort of literary things, poetry. This is potent. I don't know if any of you have read. You probably have Kaminsky, Deafness on the Deaf Republic. Have you read this? It's a marvelous poem. What happens is there's a political unrest, and in an occupied territory, could be anywhere, and soldiers kill a deaf boy. And in response to that, deafness and insurgency begins. The entire population becomes deaf as a protest. And it sort of concludes, our hearing doesn't weaken, but something silent in us strengthens. And that's at the heart of a democracy. It's wonderful.
It's amazing. It's amazing, Gwen. Kiko, can I press Randy on a point?
Definitely. I'm eager to too, but go ahead.
Gwen, I loved that. That's magnificent. Randy, a question and then a comment. The question is this: you like dissent, but you don't like patriotism. And I wonder if you can have both at once. The question is this: you would say, would you, that you have the same have the same obligation to protest an injustice in Kathmandu as you do in California?
No. And I think gosh, Michael, we're going back half a century now. So I live in the United States of America, and when things are being done wrong here, do I feel differently towards if I pick up the paper and I read about things being done wrong somewhere else? And yeah, I do feel differently. Why do I feel differently? In part, I feel differently because like it or not, like it or not, I am part of this collective called the United States of America. I vote, I have a passport, I pay taxes, I'm part of the thing here. And because I'm part of the thing here, I feel more implicated. I feel more of an obligation. It hurts me more. It's closer to me. It hurts me more. I feel differently towards things going on, even if they are, even if it's in California, 3,000 miles away, even if it were in Hawaii, and that's 6,000 miles away, but I'm still part of this thing. So now I've given a reason, though, that's a little bit different than what I think when the people talk about patriotism, my sense is that they're talking usually about more than, sort of a bureaucratic thing or more than proximity. They're talking about something mystical. And I guess what I'm questioning is the mystical stuff.
Well, if I could just make an observation. With dissent, it's even harder than protest to disconnect it from patriotism for the following reason. We could all protest an injustice halfway around the world. But dissent seems to be a special category of protest. Protest, when we protest an injustice halfway around the world, we're standing in opposition to it, in moral and political opposition to it. But when we dissent, we're standing not only in opposition, but it's also, dissent is also an act of dissociation, which suggests that dissent, unlike protest in general, is only possible under conditions of presumed consent. That's why it's dissent, going back to the distinction Pratap drew and the centrality of consent that he identified in the issue about consent. Yes?
I think
Do you
there's
see the force of that?
no, I see I mean, again, dissent, you know, why are we so pained when something happens? Why am I so pained? I bet everybody, why am I so pained when something happens here as opposed to there? Yeah, it's in my name. I am associated with. I understand that, and so I think that your distinction between dissent and protest in general, yeah, I think there's something there. I grant you that. I still, however, am concerned about the aspect of patriotism which suggests that it should be unconditional, that there's still a mysticism in
Right,
the patriotism discussion that makes me deeply uncomfortable.
Right, sure.
And let's go on to some other questions and comments. I know Anne, Holly, and then Peter.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I wanted to respond to both Randy and Jim about the fact that there isn't a narrative or a story or a song that is propelling our current movement to protest or to dissent from what's going on in our culture. And I don't really know why, but when you think about what happened in the 19th century with Uncle Tom's Cabin or Suffering in Africa, two books that really changed people's perception about slavery who hadn't really engaged with it, or even during our own movement against the war, the folk singers and the songs that gave energy to all of us. And I don't know why it isn't here now. And I thought maybe others would have an idea about that, whether it's the commercial culture has so submerged the more spontaneous volunteer culture or what. But I do think if we had some better songs for Randy and some better stories for Jim, that we would lift what we're engaging with. Particularly, the Black Lives Matter movement has been so powerful. And yet I can think of only one work, and that's the poet Rankin's book, Citizen. And that's so long and involved that it hasn't been able to speak to masses of people. So why, I guess, is my question.
Peter, do you want to take a crack at that and then make the comment you were thinking of, or bring up the question you were thinking of?
All right. Well, I think I plain agree with what Anne said. It's not so much a comment. My comments, and I'm going to lead back, I'm afraid, to Pratap, but my comments are that I think we would all agree that Navalny is a man of conscience, and the pro-democracy people in Hong Kong are people of great courage, like Navalny, great courage with their acts of conscience. I feel that our greatest dissenter in the 20th century, and I agree with Randy Kennedy when he
pointed out some white people like Garrison and Phillips and Sumner, who were great dissenters against slavery in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, I do feel our greatest dissenter was Martin Luther King. And the hardest thing that he ever had to do, and he got so much criticism for this, was when, as one of you pointed out, perhaps it was Jim Carroll, that when he dissented against the Vietnam War, risking, and many Black Americans thought, no, don't do this now, because you're bifurcating your own cause. We want civil rights. Never mind, let the protesters. And I love what Jim Carroll said about the nonviolent movements against the war being so effective. But this was a great act of conscience. I don't know of a greater act in the 20th century. And here to Pratap again, are you aware, Pratap, that when Martin Luther King went to India, and he didn't call it a visit or a trip, he called it a pilgrimage, because he got it all from Gandhi. And that was his act of a great act of conscience. And my last thing I wanted to say about patriotism is I've always liked what Dr. Johnson said, that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. And Graham Greene said, I'd far rather betray my country than a friend. So patriotism, I think, can be a really treacherous thing in a democracy. It's obviously you shouldn't, if you're in a non-democracy, if you're in a dictatorship, patriotism just feeds the dictator. So Pratap, if you would, talk about the coming of Martin Luther King to India and tying together all the nonviolent movement of the 20th century.
Gosh, I mean, thank you for this wonderful intervention, and obviously to take a couple of seminars to go through. I just want to say, I think two very quick things on this. I mean, obviously, I think there's a kind of whole sort of arc linking kind of Thoreau, Gandhi, back to Martin Luther King. I mean, you can trace these, I think, genealogies, right? But I think there is also an interesting and I think morally slightly more troubling and I think complicated thing about the King-India relationship, which is that, of course, one of the biggest challenges of the 20th century has been to try and think of the relationship between caste and race as two different forms of injustice. And the very profound sense that while Gandhi was exemplary in many ways, he did not quite fully come out on the right side of the caste question. Not in terms of his views on caste, which did change, and I actually think a lot of his critics are unfair to how his views changed. But fundamentally, his thought that the caste problem was not a problem of empowering and giving agency to marginalized groups. It was a problem of upper caste guilty conscience. So they, in a sense, had to undergo a form of kind of self-purification. And that's what Dr. Ambedkar completely loathed about Gandhi, that even in this overcoming of the system, he's made it about, in a sense, upper caste moral redemption, not about the agency of the lower castes. And I think I think, and in that sense, I think the parallel, I think, to the race debate, and I think when King came to India, he got kind of both sides of it. I mean, which is that at one level, a moral imagination that's very much, in a sense, influenced by, or at least follows in Gandhi's tradition. And yet, at the same time, a kind of identification with untouchables who actually, in some senses, were drawing away from Gandhi just at that point. And in fact, I think at this historical juncture, I think, I think Gandhi's record is much less popular. And what's interesting about Dr. King, in the sense, he carries both sides of those legacies equally powerfully. And what makes him such a powerful figure is his ability to, in a sense, identify with both sides of that argument. Gandhi's moral imagination, yet not losing sight of the fact that ultimately liberation and freedom is about a certain kind of self-dignity and empowerment. It's not about a kind of third party acting for the purposes of purifying their own moral conscience, as Ambedkar interpreted Gandhi to be doing.
To broaden the discussion, Adriana Gutierrez, your thoughts, your questions on the broad theme of speaking out. Thank you, Pratap, for that. Was a really great clarification.
Thank you, Kiku. I've been thinking, I find fascinating all the comments that everyone has been saying, but especially the one on patriotism has stirred in me different thoughts. And because I really think that patriotism means different things for different people. The white supremacist conceives himself as a patriot. And what he's doing is fighting for a certain kind of country that is very different from the person on the Black Lives Matter fighting force. And I think that in general, I tend to associate patriotism, again, with a mandate of the state, with the kind of consent that Michael was referring to, but the official foundational narrative of a country, which may not be the one that is accurate for a certain moment in history. And as I think of the Black Lives Matter movement and how it has taken in Latin America, because of course the same thing happens in Brazil, and the same thing happens in other countries that have Afro-descendant populations that haven't been even recognized as Afro-descendant by the same official narrative of the state. So I think that there are movements or like Gandhi and Martin Luther King that can inspire in different regions and in different cultures because they appeal to a fundamental injustice of a society that is moving, regardless of whether the state wants to preserve a narrative that may or may not be accurate for a certain moment in time. So, yeah. Those are my thoughts.
I wanted to ask you a follow-up and then go to Gary Knight. Tell us a little bit about groups. We talked a lot about leaders, but there are a lot of very imaginative and successful protest groups. For example, Alfombra Roja in Peru. Just explain to the group that what form of protest and other forms of creative protest, of people's protests, not so much coming from leadership, but from people's organizations.
Yeah, I mean, Alfombra Roja is amazing, and it leads to what Anne was asking about the power of art to inspire protest. And Alfombra Roja, or Red Carpet, is a group of feminists. It's a feminist group in Peru that opposes the control of women's bodies in the form of, the prohibition of abortion or the forced sterilization, which also happened in indigenous regions in Peru. So when the legislature had to put into law these two sides of a coin and they had to vote, these women dressed themselves in red and put themselves as a carpet so that the legislators had to literally walk on their bodies in order to access their Supreme Court or their equivalent. And that was visually very powerful. And it made people realize that that's what they were doing to women's bodies. And of course, that is not a specific of Peru. And now it has chapters in so many other countries. So you can Google or find Alfombra Roja, red carpet, because it happens in Spain and it happens in Latin America. And again, it's a call to creative thinking, also to go to Randy's point of the boring chants of protests. What can we do, or how can art mobilize people in a way that is creative and powerful enough to make people see what they are not seeing? Because some forms of dissent are not going to be evident to everyone. And Black Lives Matter is a great point. It wasn't until it was. And so on so many of feminist issues, especially when they really go into becoming a law that really impose restrictions on women's bodies, sometimes people are not seeing what they mean if they are not a woman or if they are not an Afro-descendant person. So art can have this amazing power of mobilizing and making think people outside of their identity, and to really see the other person as a human being and then identify with their cause. So I think I agree with Anne that maybe we are not seeing yet newish forms of art, or maybe they are just percolating differently, but I am sure that they are there. And they will come out, because art is necessarily a form of dissent and of consciousness that goes farther from the patriotic official standard of thinking a community.
Last question as a follow-up. Today in Spain is Mother's Day, and mothers have played a critical role in protest. And just give us the one last example, which is very powerful and will lead us into Gary, who co-founded the Seven Foundation, international photojournalist, to talk about the power of photographs as speech in the public square. The Mothers of the Disappeared. This is another profound, this is good for Randy, another profound form of protest in Argentina, in Chile. Describe to the group their role in the use of photographs.
Well, because they were protesting to know the whereabouts of their children and grandchildren. And the only way that they could visualize them was to putting up their photographs. So that's how they started. And now many movements have recouped that image of a person's portrait as a missing identity and to challenge power. And I think that the power of the Madres de Plaza de Mayo came from the fact that they had no power whatsoever. So in a way, it goes very much into the Gandhi way of protesting, because they knew that they were completely vulnerable, but they had lost their children, and that was beyond the loss that they could endure. So they were willing to risk everything. And the fact, and the dictatorship and the military was not going to charge against the grandmas. So they also knew that their social value as mothers gave them some kind of leverage as a group. And whether that has been replicated or not, it really depends on the context, because I was just thinking of the mothers at the border between Mexico and the US, and how motherhood hasn't been the force that has avoided the separation of families. So what worked in the case of Argentina really is not working at the border, that people are not presenting themselves as surrogates for those mothers, and motherhood hasn't been strong enough a cause to stop it. So I think we've found a limit there, and I'm struggling to know why something as cruel and as unthinkable as separating mothers from their children has not caught up more anger in US society. I don't know why.
So this morning I was just reading my newspaper, and I was reading about Myanmar, a country I'm very familiar with and have worked in a lot. And I was reading about Northern Ireland because this week is the 40th anniversary of the death of Bobby Sands, who starved himself to death in the Maze prison in protest at the British government not recognizing IRA prisoners as political prisoners. And Sands, as well as being a member of the IRA, was the first member of the IRA who won a seat in the British Parliament for Sinn Féin. And that began a process then of Martin McGuinness, the head of the IRA, moving to politics, and the IRA really adopting politics as a means of challenging the British government and moving away from violence. So with Myanmar in mind, and with Northern Ireland perhaps in mind, I wanted to ask the panel, as we've been discussing today, really peaceful dissent against state violence and state power, I wonder, is there a role for violent dissent ever? Is violent dissent legitimate when confronted with state violence and state power?
It's a great question. It needs to be on the table. My answer is yes, under certain circumstances. I mean, I'm not a pacifist. So can there be forms of oppression that justify picking up the gun to challenge and overcome that oppression? And my answer is yes. Now, I don't say that lightly, and again, Jim is in the house, and the unleashing of violence is a very serious thing. And as far as I'm concerned, we should, be loath to reach for the gun, should try all sorts of alternatives. And frankly, even after reaching for the gun, that's not enough. One still, even when one is using violence, has to, as far as I'm concerned, there are ethical constraints even then. But to answer your question, no, I don't put the use of violence as a mode of dissent. I do not take that off the table. While I've just one quick other thing, I just want to say hallelujah with the comment that was made about Martin Luther King Jr. and his dissent with respect to the Vietnam War. I just, in my little notes here, I've tied that up with my praise for the abolitionists, because King, you were absolutely right. I mean, there were a lot of Black folk in particular who had marched with King and who were, totally with him, and who were really angry. I mean, Carl Rowan, I knew Carl Rowan. Carl Rowan, very distinguished Black journalist, Black, he was in the Kennedy administration, and he was just angry as all get out with Martin Luther King Jr. for crossing Lyndon Johnson, who had done more than any president to help Black Americans. Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65. And here was Martin Luther King Jr. turning against him. And one of the things that I think was so wonderful about what King was willing to do, as far as King was concerned, it was more than what was good for Black people. His critics were saying, hey, this ain't good for Black people. But for King, what are you talking about? That, what's good for Black people, that's a consideration. but what's good for humanity. And that was the greatness of King. And I'm really happy that you brought up King in that particular light. But going back to violence, yeah, under certain circumstances, violence, as far as I'm concerned, is justified.
Just want to push you on one thing, Randy, because we were talking before about the period of Reconstruction, fighting against slavery, and there are two contrasting figures I'd like your opinion on in terms of pushing the point about using violence. One is John Brown, your assessment of him, and explain for the whole group what he did, just to fill everyone in since we've got an international group. And the other is Thaddeus Stevens and the stand he took in the most radical elements, and just give the group a quick background. But first, John Brown, because it raises the issue of the use of violence.
John Brown was a white American abolitionist who reached for the gun. He, in the late 1850s, gathered together a group, a multiracial group, and he raided a United States armory at Harper's Ferry with the idea of starting a slave rebellion. I mean, he thought that he was going to raid, and he thought that slaves were going to rise up. And he was caught and he was executed. Within Black America, John Brown has largely been celebrated. H. Rap Brown was once asked, it was either H. Rap Brown or Stokely Carmichael was once asked, are there any white people who you trust? And one of them initially said, no, I don't trust any white people that took too much. And then he said, oh, with the exception of John Brown. So anyway, that's who John Brown was. Now, you mentioned others who were dissenters. My favorite of the abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison, who was a pacifist, a thoroughgoing pacifist. Thaddeus Stevens was not. Thaddeus Stevens was a politician who was anti-slavery, though he did not call himself an abolitionist. To have called yourself an abolitionist in antebellum America was to make yourself unelectable. So he did not call himself, he was in fact an abolitionist, but he did not call himself an abolitionist. Just like Charles Sumner, he did not call himself an abolitionist, though in fact he was, which raises the question of, repertoire of protest. When do you make concessions? When do you compromise? Thaddeus Stevens was willing to compromise. Charles Sumner was willing to compromise. They were politicians. They felt that they had to compromise in order to get things done. William Lloyd Garrison, no, forget it. In fact, William Lloyd Garrison, before the Civil War, he said, let's secede from the Union. He was an abolitionist secessionist. So the long and the short of it is, you can have dissenters of various sorts. And, John Brown was an abolitionist, white abolitionist dissenter who picked up the gun.
Talk to us a little bit about the more specific question of dissent in terms of, you have this new book, The Truth at the Heart of the Lie. More specifically, you've written very deeply historically about anti-Semitism, the history of the Catholic Church. Tell us a little bit about this moment of dissent for you.
Well,
and what motivated you to write the book?
Well, I will, but I'll return to Gary's question about pacifism as a way into that, trying to be very brief. I am a pacifist, unlike Randy, but I'm a pacifist who allows for possible moral moments when an act of violence is required. Now, the reason I'm saying I'm a pacifist is to demonstrate my radical distrust of the violent act, even if in rare circumstances it's necessary. Dietrich Bonhoeffer associated himself with the plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. I can imagine having made that choice myself. But the IRA is a case in point, and Gary probably knows this better than I do. The IRA is an act of revolution that ate its children. The violence of the IRA was not primarily violence against the British Army. It was violence against the Irish people. And in my view, that followed the track of the violent impulse in history again and again and again. Our moral war against Hitler ended with our embrace of nuclear weapons, which still threaten the extinction of the human species. Can we be pacifists in the sense of understanding the radical necessity to reject violence while allowing exceptions? The US Civil War is clearly an event in which we would have to allow exceptions. I don't want to belabor my own argument with the Catholic Church. It's not interesting for most folks, but it's related to this question because the moral triumphalism of Roman Catholicism, putting power over the call to service, which is what Christianity intended to be, is an act of radical refusal to be self-critical. And it's the refusal of the Catholic hierarchy to be self-critical, that is to say, extend normal adjudication to rapist priests, which is the ground of my problem with the Catholic Church, is an instance of virtue being carried away with itself. And the violent revolution can be virtue, a cause we all support, being carried away with itself. It's part of the human condition. It's a dynamic that inflicts itself on all human beings in every period of history. Roman Catholicism is exhibit A of that today. White supremacy is exhibit A of that today. Male supremacy is exhibit A of that today. A triumphalist preference of power over equality is the issue. And that skepticism of power is the ground of my skepticism of violence.
We cannot improve on anything Jim Carroll just said on the violence, non-violence question. It's closer to, I think my position, and I think particularly, I mean, I think this conjuncture of a kind of collective narcissism and violence that I think often goes together in the name of nationalism, I think is something that one has to particularly guard against. And I think almost most calls to violence kind of, I think, cloak themselves in that, I think, consecration, I think, of death, which can be dangerous. But I honestly, I think after Jim's wonderful articulation, perhaps we can let others in the conversation.
I do have something, Kiku, but Mishi is also waiting. So shall I hold my comment?
Mishi and Ilana both have
Ilana,
questions or comments. So Mishi and then Ilana. Mishi from Jerusalem.
Hi. So my question is actually perhaps fittingly for the end of the discussion, or towards the end of the discussion here, is actually about the end of dissent, or the desired or even moral end of dissent. So we talked at the beginning about external limitations that are placed on dissent, but I would love to hear what the panelists' thoughts are on when and maybe even if a dissent movement ever has the obligation to end its own dissent. And to illustrate this and make it perhaps a little bit more concrete, I'll just give a very quick example that perhaps goes back to Michael's distinction or observation about democracy as a movement and democracy as a moment. So as Kiku just said, I'm Israeli, and as many of you will know, we just had our 4th election in 2 years. And in the last year or so, there was a very robust grassroots protest movement against the prime minister, and especially protesting his assaults on Israeli democratic institutions. And the movement grew and grew, and in the weeks leading up to the elections, there were, I think, close to 100,000 people waving black flags from bridges all over the country every Saturday night. But then the elections happened and the Prime Minister's party won a plurality of the votes. And the following Saturday night, and in the Saturday nights that followed, the organizers of the demonstrations, in the name of their own campaign for democracy, decided to stop their demonstrations. So I guess the question is there ever a moment in which a dissent has to say, okay, that I had my moment and it wasn't accepted?
Michael.
Well, I'll come to that, but did Ilana want to say something first? Go ahead.
Sure. I guess it some ways relates to that question, but I'm very curious specifically about two circumstances that I could imagine would justify violence and what folks would make of those. So the first is the argument from self-defense. I find it really difficult to grapple with what constitutes actually like an existential cause that might merit violence from a dissent movement, violence as a form of self-defense. So for instance, I think like the Black Lives Matter movement is a really good example for folks who feel that their lives are being put on the line by a form of state violence or oppression. I think I can sort of easily understand, although I can't personally identify with it as a white person, like why that might justify violence. But then I start to think about things that are slower in how they harm people, like the climate crisis, which also disproportionately impacts certain communities. And I wonder if there's a reasonable argument, for instance, that violence could be justified in dissenting against states that are essentially, driving climate change, whether by being inert or by failing to pass certain legislation, and thereby, I think, inflicting harm upon vast numbers of people.
I would like to pick up on a thread that's run through this discussion, which is the relation between dissent and consent. Pratap started us out by juxtaposing the two and showing how acts of dissent can puncture the myth of consent. And when we're talking about speaking out, that's one form of dissent. And then Gary asked the question about violence, whether violence is ever justified as a form of consent. And along the way, we discussed the growing intolerance of many governments to occupations as forms of dissent, if they inconvenience the public. We spoke about labor strikes. The question that these strands of the discussion raised for me is, can dissent sometimes be coercive? And violence is an example of coercive dissent, hence Gary's question. But there are there are forms of dissent between violence on the one hand and speaking out on the other that do exercise degrees of coerciveness. Occupying a public space, a labor strike. I think Pratap said that Ambedkar thought that dissent was holding democracy to ransom. That's the image of holding to ransom. That's a kind of coercion. Now, in the case of India, thinking about this spectrum of the extent to which dissent can be coercive, I wanted to ask Pratap about a particular kind of dissent that has a history in India, not only in India, but it has a special history in India, and is sometimes said, especially in a democracy, to be coercive, and that's a hunger strike.
Yeah.
Is a hunger strike an especially coercive or paradigmatically coercive kind of dissent? And how do you think about dissent in relation to the various degrees of coerciveness that dissent can involve?
Oh gosh, what a wonderful question. So, the question of the hunger strike is actually an extraordinarily important one. And again, to go back to the sort of well-rehearsed historic theme of Gandhi versus Ambedkar, I mean, one of the things that Ambedkar deeply resented about Gandhi was his resort to a hunger strike, which is that this really is sort of putting your death on my conscience. This
Right.
is actually not an argument. This is an extraordinary form of coercion. And it was particularly, I think, interesting because, I mean, just to take an example from the completely other end of the spectrum, I mean, Jim Carroll will remember this better than I, but in Gandhi's instruction to satyagrahis, Gandhi actually says criticism is a form of violence. In fact, he says to all his fellow satyagrahis, never criticize somebody who does not join your movement. The only thing you can do is exhibit your power of exemplarity, but you cannot criticize them. So, from completely the other end of the spectrum, where even an act of criticism was thought of by Gandhi as exercising a kind of form of violence. So, in some senses, in that one singular figure, you have these two sort of, extraordinary moments, thinking about violence. So my own view is I actually do think a hunger strike, and particularly if the form that it takes is a kind of fast onto death, which is the kind of historical tradition, not just a token hunger strike, not just a relay hunger strike for a week or something. I actually do think the fast onto death is a coercive form, I think, of protest. Because ultimately, I think if it succeeds, it doesn't allow you to distinguish whether the reason it succeeded was simply because somebody did not want your death on their conscience, or whether they actually converted to the legitimacy of your cause, which is really, in a sense, the ultimate test of a good civil disobedient movement, that you're actually converting people by your exemplarity in some ways. And in that sense, I actually think I think Ambedkar was right. I think that, and again, also on the occasion with Gandhi, which is that if, to use, I think, Jim Carroll's very helpful thing about the dialectic between consent and dissent, which is, if you cannot at the end of the day then distinguish between authentic and inauthentic consent, and a fast onto that induces that, then I think it is actually, I think in most cases it will be problematic. Now, could there be an instance where the cause is just so morally compelling and there is actually no other avenue? Possibly, yes. But I think in most circumstances it's been exercised, it does have an element of coercion to it. I think Gandhi's other proposition, whether criticism itself is a form of coercion, because it hurts, because it wounds, and whether you should rely on exemplarity rather than criticism, I think is an interesting proposition to think about.
Aaron and then Randy.
I think it's useful to think about whether criticism can be violence, because similarly, when we talk about things like violence, that's separate from, for example, aggression. And there may be many sources of violence that we see in our society that don't look that violent, whereas an act of aggression, a physical attack, may or may not be violent. So I'm intrigued by the fact that criticism may be violent, but in other cases, maybe killing someone might not be violent, potentially. But I'm really interested in the distinction between protest and dissent. Michael, you were saying that dissent necessarily assumes consent as sort of a basis. And I think what you're implying there is that to dissent, you need to be part of the community. It's a form of protest that is only possible if you're in the community. If you're protesting something, you may or may not be in the community. And I think, to Alana's point, you can protest for animals that aren't humans. I don't think you could dissent in the same way. And there's also the idea of protest, just a theme that I've been noticing throughout. We think of protests as activism, and I think we're often drawn to a certain image of protest. And Pratap, you said earlier that you're not the protesting type, and yet we have you here because you're a great exemplar of protest. And maybe it's not the type where you're saying no justice, no peace that Randy is tired of, but it's a different type of protest that I think is probably all the more powerful. And I also want to then sort of think maybe it's worth separating this activists from perhaps organizers. And both are important in protest. And I've also been struck that many of our examples of protest have been activists working very individually. Even the example some folks were bringing up in London of these environmental protesters, one alone on the street blocking traffic, that's not organizing. That's protest. Organizing, Miriam Kaba, the prison abolitionist, says that anything worth doing is done with other people. And I think that if we really want to, I mean, that is, I think, a better framing too for if we want to build democracy. I can see how one person acting alone could be, I don't know, like how that could be seen as separate from democracy, but it's very difficult for an authoritarian democracy, just like Lenin and others have done bad jobs of carrying out communism. I think we've done bad jobs of carrying out democracy, as we've sort of just alluded to earlier. Acting alone, you can sort of see that as separate, but if you're organizing, that is a truer sense of democracy. How possibly could you argue that to be coercive and separate from sort of be an act of violence or be a type of protest that has to be, it seems should be criminalized and sort of feared. I mean, it would be more fearful. The government would presumably be more fearful. But I think that also in doing that, in being acting collectively in community, that maybe creates a space even for Randy to be a patriot. And I totally agree with you, Randy. I sort of am irked by the idea of patriotism, but what if it's conceived a little differently? What if it's conceived of being, you're a patriot for the community that you're in and the community that you're creating? And I think also of Langston Hughes's poem, Let America Be America Again, where he sort of concludes near the end, you know, it's the poem where he says, let America be America again. In parentheticals throughout, he says, America never was America to me. And near the conclusion, he says, oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be.
Randy, excellent.
Well, there's so many things. I just three quick things. One, Jim, I want to come back to your comments on you know, your passionate and eloquent caution with respect to violence, and it certainly moved me. I still say that under certain circumstances, yes, I would justify picking up the gun, but in light of your comments, I want to underline how, you know, we should go a long way before acceding to that terrible juncture. You know, someone mentioned Black Lives Matter and the protests against you know, police misconduct. And yeah, it's a scandal, police misconduct in the United States. It's terrible. And Black Lives Matter has done a lot of good things. There is a problem, however, in the way in which sometimes people talk about the police misconduct problem. So, you know, certainly in the law school, you know, I teach in a law school, and there'll be students who will be talking about police misconduct, and they'll go, they'll whip themselves into a fury, and the police, and the police are just doing these violent things, and you'll hear people talk about the police war against Black America. And then there was that case a year ago where there was a protest in New York, and two people, one of whom was a lawyer, maybe even both of them were lawyers, threw a Molotov cocktail into a police car. Question: if you really think that the police are engaged in a war against Black America, well, if that's the case, then maybe you ought to throw a Molotov cocktail into a police car. But that's not the case. I think we need to be really careful. And as soon as you put violence into the mix, the level of care needs to be, amped up 100 times. So I still say I'm not a pacifist, but I embrace the Carol caution, because over and over and over again, that's right, violence boomerangs and eats up, people who were trying to do good things. Second, Michael, on the question of coerciveness, yeah, dissent can be coercive. In the second Reconstruction, my very favorite campaign was the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955, 1956. Was it coercive? Oh yeah, it was coercive, all right. Yeah, it was coercive. Every boycott is. You can't have a strike, you can't have a boycott without some degree of coerciveness. A Black person, there were plenty of Black people who wanted to get on the bus to go to the job. Why did they not get on the bus? They didn't get on the bus because they knew that if they got on the bus, their names would be mud in the Black community. They were coerced. What do I say about that? Well, overall, it was a good thing. And by the way, sometimes you might not do something initially because you want to avoid the coercion or because you feel coerced in doing it. But over time, actually, your mind changes. And what was initially something that was just acquiescent, over time becomes an embrace of the idea behind that coercion.
Maybe your students will make their way coercing you on the police abolition eventually.
Maybe, I doubt it, but maybe. Third, on the point about criticism as a form of violence, I like Gandhi a lot, but I don't like that idea. I mean, that sounds all too much like, speech is violence. I mean, that sounds to me like this sort of postmodern talk that erases important distinctions. I don't rule it out, but I would like for anybody to give me an instance of criticism counting as what I would call violence. I can't imagine it to myself right now, but I'm open to it.
Can I just come in on that one for a second?
Yes,
No,
of course.
I completely agree with you. I mean, I think Jim may have a better formulation in this, but so one of the interesting things about Gandhi, right, is that there are a couple of occasions when he's asked about this question of violence, nonviolence. So there's one particularly interesting case where somebody writes to him and says, "Look, I've just been robbed. My house has just been burgled. But in the spirit of generosity and forgiveness, I do not want to file a police report against the perpetrator." And then he says to Gandhi, "But I nevertheless still continue to feel resentment that I was burgled and resentment at the person who did it." And Gandhi says, "Well, if you're feeling resentment, please do go ahead and file the police report." And I think the sense of violence that I think he had in mind was that forms of criticism, most forms of criticism, don't adequately take into account the particularity of the person against whom they might be directed at. So why am I not protesting? Is it because I'm a moral coward? Perhaps I'm not prepared enough. Is it because I have all kinds of other obligations? That there was something in an act, in usual forms of criticism, that disabled empathy with the particular individual circumstances. And for Gandhi, it was in a sense that disabling was a disposition that could itself then produce violence, because then this person is just an abstraction to you. Oh, he's the person who's not on our side. She's the person who's not joining our cause. She's the person who does not feel for right as well as we do. And in a sense, it was using that moral yardstick to efface a certain kind of individuality that could also itself be the source of violence. So I completely agree with you. I think if you take it literally that criticism is violence, it's of course an absurd idea. But I think the fact that our own moral frames, and particularly when we are completely convinced of our moral superiority, actually tend to construct other people as abstractions. That disposition can produce violence of different kinds. I think that's what Gandhi had more in mind.
This has been a remarkable discussion, wide-ranging when we're thinking about speaking out, how acts of conscience contend with power. And we've really focused a lot on those acts of conscience and those acts of protest and teasing it out. But when we think about power, in the case of India, a government that's tilting towards authoritarianism, the Modi government, and in other countries that are established totalitarian or authoritarian regimes, so we worry about in the United States, in what way are we moving towards a more authoritarian regime? In what way has the Republican Party lost its bearings as a democratic, engaged party under Trump? That we see the enormous power, power is able to exercise violence in all kinds of ways that covers up the violence and legitimates itself, whether it's the police or the military or others in power that can punish, ostracize, and kill any form of dissent. And so it's important when we're thinking of these moments, an idea that Gwyn brought up in the discussion about the cracks in the hold of authoritarian or totalitarian power, or a democratic power that is not acting in a democratic way, that is acting in other interests, whether that's white supremacy, global capitalism, other forms in which people are oppressed and quieted and not presented with an opportunity to speak out. So I like the idea of the cracks in the power, because it's very difficult in those initial fissures, in those initial cracks. It can be one voice there, one voice somewhere else, a group of protesters, and maybe, as we've said, they don't gain traction, or the voice is eloquent and important. In the case of Martin Luther King, he was derided and criticized for opposing the Vietnam War. And I'm wondering, Randy, just posing in my summary, but we can talk about it later, is again, his use of patriotism is one I think those of you who are skeptics of patriotism should embrace more, which is he is a citizen of the United States of America. He is speaking as a citizen, not as simply as a citizen of the world. The problems that he outlines in his famous speech, Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam, is, industrial capitalism, militarism, and racism. He names these big forms of oppression. And as Aaron cited Langston Hughes, America may not be America to me or one of us as individuals, but the idea of working for an America to be, or a Mexico to be, or an India to be, it is gathering around a set of founding principles that we agree on, that feel like they are the core of the democratic project. And it's on those principles I think a patriot stands. So tying in Jim's comment about faith and heresy, that the faith, I think, in democracy is not a form of mystical faith. When we think of this period of reconstruction, of emancipation from slavery, and the voices that spoke out before, during, and after the Civil War. When Randy mentioned Thaddeus Stevens had his radical moments, and no one went with him, to talk about the confiscation of the property of all the slavocracy of the plantation owners and redistribute that property to poor whites and poor blacks. That didn't float in his time. It's not floating. Reparations is not still in the US, not floating in our time. But this idea of the fissures, the cracks, the voices that gather strength. And so this interplay or dialectic between consent and dissent, between also the problematic way in which nonviolence and at times violence enter into our discussion of speaking out. And I think that what I like very much in the discussion beyond the leaders, to look at so many instances in which speaking out is not heard by a lot of us. It's not heard in our own country until it bursts out, so that people, for example, in the civil rights movement, many women, many church members, many children participated with their families. People spoke out since they came to this country in terms of African Americans. And so the long arc of history, it's not so much that I have a mystical belief that it bends towards justice, but it moves in this larger narrative of multiple voices, a multivocal speaking out, and lots of moments of retrenchment, in which the democratic project, and this is what we worry about in our times, seems to be moving backward and not forward. But I like the idea of being attentive to the voices we may not hear yet, to the protests that's percolating, that has not come into public view. And that the protest that does come into public view, we should still treat, even if it's by our opponents, even if it takes a violent turn, as a form of membership, in the case of each of our nations and in terms of the world community, in a community, that these forms of solidarity, I think, are the basis of what a number of you mentioned, that we are people, we are individuals, and as Hannah Arendt, the famous philosopher, said, we enter the world, we insert ourselves in the world as distinct and unique human beings through speech and action and agency. But the story is not one controlled by us. It's not told simply by us. And so this unfolding history, I think we've brought very much to bear in this discussion. And I thank our initial voices, Pratap from India. Thank you for staying up late and joining us. Randy Kennedy from right in here in the Boston area. And of course, Jim Carroll, and all of you who have participated. We look forward to future dialogues and coming together. Thanks a lot.